thank you all for joining us. We're going to have a talk today about Nouns DAO as a jumping off point into the wider topic of DAO governance, what is going right, what is going wrong, and how we can fix it if there are things that aren't going quite right. So before we get into the conversation, I just want to give everyone on stage a chance to introduce themselves quickly. So I'll start with you, Camilla.
Hi, I'm Camille Cannon. I'm the co-founder of Apiary. We're an applied research firm that works with communities, foundations, and protocol labs on bespoke governance systems.
Hi, my name is Parker J. Patirat. I'm an investor at FinTech Collective's DeFi Fund. I'm also on the founding team of Boys Club, which is a social club, community, and DAO, driving the future of culture in crypto.
Hi, I'm Noma. I'm representing Stable Lab. We are a governance service provider. We work with over 15 DAOs. We do everything from professional delegation to framework design and governance facilitation. I'm also representing Cult Collective. It's a social DAO dedicated to the advancement of cryptocurrency in Africa.
Hi, I'm Shreyas Hariharan, and I'm the co-founder of Llama. Llama is an on-chain governance and access control platform. It helps protocols issue permissions and roles, create custom action execution rules, and manage funds programmatically.
And I'm Danny Nelson, a reporter at CoinDesk. And just a quick primer for those in the crowd who might not know, Nouns DAO, which is one of the bigger NFT-based DAOs in the crypto space, last week lost $27 million of its treasury to this process that's called a fork. Basically, investors who were upset at the way Nouns DAO was going, it has a history of spending on a lot of different things. Some are a little crazy and a lot of people don't like it. They forked using a Nouns procedure into a new DAO that took control of 55% of the treasury. Now, this is interesting because it wasn't a hack or a theft like you see against a lot of on-chain things. It was within the realm of Nouns' own governance procedures. But what's weird about it is it attracted a lot of these arbitrage investors who basically exploited Nouns' own governance rules against the DAO. And the conversation that I think we should start off with here is, like, what role should token holders have in managing a DAO and making decisions, especially when their desires and their incentives are not aligned with the DAO itself? Like, Nouns DAO is all about funding proposals and proliferating this idea of Nouns as a brand. The activist investors, they don't care about that. They just want to make money, which is what a lot of people in crypto want, but it's a little bit different from the idea of a DAO. So, Noma, I'll start with you. I want to hear, is this a feature or a flaw, like the presence of activist investors in DAO governance?
I think, as with any market, there are always going to be speculators and arbitrageurs who are going to try to raid for value and take advantage of the system. And so I think with the Nouns situation, we've also seen where there is some long-standing dispute or some sort of disagreement within the DAO, the constituents of the DAO, and there are onlookers who are trying to capitalize off of that sort of dispute. They call themselves activist investors. They buy controlling shares to sort of sway decisions in the DAO. And so this is a really sort of interesting mechanism that we've seen where you have seen that there is probably going to be a push to redeem some sort of stake that you have in this DAO, and there's people on the peripheral just waiting for the right moment to take advantage of that situation, and they're sort of extracting value from the difference of the book price and then the sort of auction price of this token, and they just want to. It's not aligned with the overarching ideals of the DAO, which is to experiment, to fund public goods, to do whatever. They are honestly just speculators and trying to take advantage of a situation. And so I think it's a very nuanced discussion. I think it's very interesting how we could potentially see this Noun situation set the course for how we accommodate various perspectives in an open market, in an open DAO where anyone is probably able to participate. I'm interested in just seeing how there are, I think we can augment these mechanisms to not just, leave these people on the outside, but also think about how we can incorporate them into various forms of like the same DAO. I think now the fork situation has shown that you can actually exit a DAO and continue. You can have different versions of the same ideal, and even though there's nuance, there can be structures to accommodate that nuance.
I think whether or not we think that what just happened in Nouns DAO is right or wrong, the fact of the matter is that by the governance design of the DAO itself, this was completely fair and permissible. If we're just looking on a logic-based level. The opportunity that I think, though, that this calls into question is really an opportunity to examine and interrogate the means by which governance and governance power is delegated, measured, and distributed within a DAO. I think personally, I'm a believer that rage quitting and the ability to rage quit is a great thing. I see it as a form of direct democracy. But I think something that maybe we can take a moment to examine here, and that would be productive to interrogate, is not whether or not what happened in Nouns DAO recently was right or wrong, but what does this really uncover or reveal about how we might think about governance, delegation, and measuring that delegation in the future.
And where do you come out on that spectrum? What do you think the takeaway should be?
So, personally, I'm not a fan of financialized governance. From a baseline level, from a first principles level, I don't think it's smart to allocate governance power and decision-making power over the future of your protocol, your organization, or your business to simply the people who can pay the most money for it. If we actually think about what makes organizations successful, it's delegating power and decision-making power to people who have skin in the game, people who have context, people who have aligned incentives with the actual values and the goal of the DAO itself. I think within Nouns DAO in specific, I'm not a member, so I only know kind of more about the design from research. But from my understanding, the way that governance power is gained is by owning NFTs, right? And so it's one NFT, one vote. But if I'm a whale and I have the ability to obtain all the NFTs, I have the ability to change the entire course of the DAO with one vote, even if the rest of the entire organization disagrees. And we've actually seen this played out many times. We've seen the downfalls and the dangers of a token-based voting mechanism across everything from MakerDAO to MangoDAO and many others.
Mm-hmm. And this, I want to hear from you in a second, Camilla, but just for the audience, this idea of the whale taking majority control, it's not a problem that's unique to DAOs. This idea of a 51% attack where someone has control of 51% of a network's validators, it's the same thing just from a different angle. And it's a problem that you always run into when you're trying to build these decentralized systems. Well, what if some actor comes in with different goals from the rest of the group, takes control in whatever ways, because in an open network that's always possible, and bends it to their will. So the question is, how do organizations protect against that without sacrificing this idea that they need to be decentralized? So where do you come out on this?
I think that Nouns was a social experiment, or is a social experiment, and I would be careful to say that the goal of the DAO was X. The goal of the DAO was to proliferate nouns, simply because I think there was a bifurcation within the community from the get-go about what the intent was behind their collaboration. And I think from a very, very baseline human collaboration standpoint, it is difficult to collaborate over time if you don't agree on the direction. And so what happened in terms of this attack, whether you see it as adversarial or just part of the system, is, I think, a byproduct of the fact that you had two fractions of a community who disagreed, it weakened it, and someone came in and saw an opportunity. How you protect against that, if you actually have a shared goal, I think is one around culture, right? If everyone had agreed, no, the goal of this is actually to proliferate nouns, this is the point of the community, we're excited to invest millions of dollars in marketing campaigns, we want to donate in these directions. Had an investor, a group of activist investors come in and tried to dismantle it, you would have probably had more action to the contrary. And so there's a social context and cohesion component of governance that I think is overlooked in this context, that would have probably done something to protect against it if this is something that you're trying to protect against. And I think beyond that, we need more nuanced governance structures, right? I think we're sort of flip-flopping between centralization as we envision it within corporations and something equivalent to cooperatives. But the reality of most governance systems within institutions and democracies and the world over is that there's a lot of gray in how they are actually implemented, and in many ways the devil's in the details in how those rules are constructed and how policy is developed.
And Shreyas, could you give us some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think in summary, I think one of the issues with how governance is structured today is that decentralization is achieved through token distribution rather than through, say, access control. And so in our view, you've got to start off with first defining on-chain which stakeholder should have access to doing what on-chain with the protocol. So for example, in a lending protocol, exactly which stakeholder, for example, should update risk parameters and how those parameters should be updated, and then where do, say, token holders, which is another stakeholder, play a role in that whole process. And so our simple view is that contributors and core teams should make routine periodic decisions, but token holders should prevent abuses of power. Because if you have token holders make routine decisions, then there are a bunch of issues with that. One, they don't typically have the expertise to do that. Second, there's a lot of apathy, and so they're not typically motivated to make the routine decisions. The analogy would be if you're running Apple or Google, you're not asking shareholders to vote on what the color of the logo should be or whether there should be an upgrade to the software. But today, token holders are entrusted to do that. And then lastly, when you combine token holders plus delegation, which is what we're seeing more of today, in my view, delegation leads to the emergence of politicians. And politicians are very useful in some contexts, in our opinion, in the context of preventing abuses of power. But politicians, again, are not meant to kind of make these routine upgrades or work on sophisticated sort of technical proposals. And so, yeah, if you had to just summarize it, it's important for more DAO protocol structures to revolve around contributors and core teams doing the routine decisions, while the financial stakeholders preventing something bad from happening or approving when, which stakeholder should have the permission to do that.
So one thing that is really interesting to me on this panel, with Stable Lab is very active in governance and helping companies and helping DAOs shape what it means to have good governance. And sometimes that means coming in and assisting a DAO that just their governance mechanisms were failing, or maybe not fail is a strong word, but weren't working out so well, whether that's quorum or other issues. So could you tell us some of the experiences that you've had in designing and helping DAOs navigate these waters?
Absolutely. So we engage with a very diverse range of DAOs, from DeFi DAOs to protocol DAOs, and they all have very different needs. And so a lot of the time we're coming in, whether sort of designing this framework and this structure from scratch, or augmenting and adapting it to fit the evolving needs of the protocol. And so we have seen in certain times where DeFi DAOs might need to bootstrap with a core team or with a centralized foundational structure, and they're looking for ways to disintermediate themselves from some core procedures in the protocol. And so we're thinking of the right sort of like mechanisms to support that. Another thing that's been really important for us in sort of like designing these governance frameworks and structures is defining the social contract of the DAO that binds the members of the DAOs together, and also outlining like what levers, what controls are there to support that. In this ecosystem, in this climate, we know that there are a lot of external factors that change the sort of like priorities of the DAO members, and that also, we need to create a space for that to evolve along with the needs of the DAO. And so we find ourselves thinking about what sort of like structures, working groups, how can we make sure that we're centering transparency, we're creating frameworks for delegates to participate. We specialize in professional delegation, and so having a space where it's outlined what the responsibilities of a delegate are and how they can continue to contribute to the ecosystem and to the DAO is like absolutely essential. We're thinking about ways that we can continue to sort of like collaborate with the core team and have them act as like a line of defense without alienating the wider community. And so it's just been really interesting to engage in a bunch of different DAOs and like see what the needs are, what works, what doesn't work, and just sort of like proceed with that.
And what doesn't work?
What doesn't work is, I think, what I've seen is relinquishing control too fast. Because I think we espouse decentralization, we want to empower stakeholders in the ecosystem, but also staying aware of the fact that decentralized, like empowering constituents of a decentralized ecosystem can sometimes undermine the decentralization of that ecosystem. And so having the right checks and balances, having the right sort of like frameworks and groups of people to act as lines of defenses when there might be a need to do so is really important. So having, I think, the right approach and the right timeline to decentralizing, not too soon, but also not too late, is something that I've seen.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've observed similar to what you're saying is that today you just have protocols and DAOs either be running by a core team of 3 to 10 people, or launch a token and then have thousands or tens of thousands of stakeholders govern of this project, and there's nothing in between. And Llama actually, which is an on-chain governance framework, the way we've worked with a lot of protocols prior to this, and one of the lessons we had is that this this approach just doesn't seem to work in practice. And instead, what you should have is just some way that teams can, even when they're like 5 people, can have a clear audit trail of who has permissions to make what decisions on chain, what the admin functions are, and what the consequences are of calling those functions for the users, for the community members, for the stakeholders. And then how do you kind of decentralize from there? Like if you have 5 people, let's say, entrusted with calling a pause function of a protocol, can you allow the community of not thousands of people, but like 10 other people who are power users to veto or disapprove that action? Can you then maybe, if you're sort of approving or whitelisting a certain asset, a service provider, can you have, a group of 15 power users involved in that process? And then kind of have your decentralization training wheels begin from there, where you have maybe months or maybe even a few years of doing that over time. And then when you're ready, you launch a token, and then you kind of are very clear on what the role of the token holder base should be versus the role of the contributors or the users or the core teams.
I think no, go ahead. I think you're both speaking to a challenge as well, which is there's often the conflation between what does it mean to decentralize your operations and what does it mean to decentralize governance. And what you're describing is get to a place where your operations are in good form and can actually face the challenge of decentralized governance rather than having operationally oriented decisions end up being made as governance decisions where the altitude of information of governance participants is completely disconnected from the brass tacks localized information that's actually necessary to fund something, to pick a service provider, to even make an update on a protocol.
I agree. I think we are today suffering from an extreme lack of intentionality in governance design. We're defaulting to the models that have been very predominant, over the last few years, but we're not critically questioning them. We're not really examining them. And if we look across different case studies over time and different vulnerabilities that the predominant model of token-based voting has presented, time and time again, we see failure. We see failure in a disintegration and a churn of actual community members and active voters. We see vulnerability in presenting open vectors for governance attacks and threats. And we see, like you alluded to, a lot of apathy of people who initially maybe joined a DAO or joined a community or organization really interested in the mission, really excited about it, and actually coming with something valuable to contribute, who over time see, as these governance processes play out, that their vote doesn't matter. No matter how hard they work on a proposal, no matter how much they've been thinking about or planning around or doing research for changing something in the DAO that they hope will be better and benefit the end goal or the community, their vote is completely washed away by one or two people who own the majority of the tokens in the treasury. And so what I really think we can take away here, and what I also want to echo and emphasize is, I really think that more experimentation is necessary and will only benefit DAOs as a whole. I think we all have gathered in this room and are in this industry because we want to change something. But if time and time again we are seeing the same failures play out and we're not questioning them and we're not experimenting with new ways of doing things or thinking critically around them, it's really just frankly not a good look. I also think that there's this really comical just kind of paradox of the idea of a DAO and the concept of a DAO and the fact that DAOs in crypto today are pretty plutocratic. And that's really not what they were initially designed to solve for. One other quick thing that I'll build upon is there's a lot of governance purists who believe in pure governance centralization. I do think the delegation of roles and teams and responsibilities and thoughtfulness around the design of onboarding into a DAO and onboarding into a governance system is extremely important. I've led a lot of the creation and design of Boys Club DAO, which is the working group within Boys Club. And the way we've designed that is we have several different guilds, each guild working on a different operational area of Boys Club. Each guild has 1 to 2 leads that recruit their teams within those guilds. And then governance is 1 person, 1 vote, with a governance board implemented, and that board being the founding team and the guild leaders that ultimately should never have to, but can, if necessary, veto or block a proposal from going through that could adversely affect the DAO in a serious way.
Can I add on something? I think we also we're conflating ideology with values, I think, when we think about governance design. And by that I mean there's an ideology that broad-based inclusion and participation will net out for the positive, despite the fact that culturally in this room, how many of us are actively participating in governance in any realm of our lives. And so rather than working against human nature, which may not actually be participatory in the first step of action. There's a design question of, do you design for intervention? Do you design for protection rather than participation? I'm not advocating for that, but I'm rather advocating for, can we flip the question on its head and actually force ourselves to think in a little bit more of a creative way about what are the metrics of success for these organizations, and how much are we biasing the way that we are approaching the design of governance based off of our own presuppositions about what would be good ideologically, given that we all live in a democracy and we all, have values that we operate within. I'm not sure that we're looking at it in necessarily a neutral way, and I think that could be to our detriment.
So I think I'm hearing a common theme that there's just something that isn't working so well when you have tokens connected to voting. I think that's a fair assessment generally from what we're all saying here. And the question that I have then is, maybe you partly answered it, but how do we get people that don't really care so much about the core thing to care if we divorce the financial aspect from the process? And maybe the answer is it's okay that we just separate the two.
I think that these networks are inherently multi-stakeholder by nature, and different stakeholder groups, whether that be developers, users, contributors in other form, in addition to financial investors, are needed for the system to function well. And so the question is, what decisions does the system need to make, and who is going to be impacted by those decisions? What unique information do they have, and how do you ensure that those stakeholders are really in dynamic tension with each other as they are making decisions? Because if one group leaves, the whole ecosystem isn't going to function. It's much more of an organism than an organization as we currently conceive it to be.
I think, to me, the answer to your question is pretty simple. Like, if there are, people who don't care and are only in it for the financial incentives, they should be in DAOs that are designed for that. If the assumption being made and asking that question is that we don't want that, then DAOs should design around that, right? So that really just comes back to this fundamental question of what incentives are we designing for? If our goal is to build an organization where financialization is not the utmost determining factor in governance power, then designing around that to find a way to account for what does matter to that organization from the get-go in the governance design seems important.
I will say, I think it still points back to the conversation about nuance. And I think the noun situation has contextualized that in a lot of different ways, where there is this system that is dependent on sort of onboarding new participants by this auction mechanism. Even without having a stake in the ecosystem, by holding this NFT, you're able to participate in governance and you're able to benefit from the funding of those public goods. But more and more, it seemed like the constituents of the DAO became more factionalized. There were people that like the brand, like Noun's DAO, but have different ideals of how this thing should play out. Some people are more concerned with the book value, growing the treasury. Some people are more concerned with the meme value and proliferating this brand and its cultural message. And I think it's shown us that there are ways for those two sort of factions to exist. They don't have to exist in the same space necessarily, but I think this space is characterized by open source software, and that is made to be forked. And so if we're thinking about forking, not just as a reaction to a bad actor or a hack, as a means to expand the conversation and allow different versions of the same ideal to exist, and have people carry out their sort of ideal visions of what this thing should be, and be empowered in doing that. You're allowed to make this equitable exit from this overarching entity and carry this on with people that are aligned with your vision. And I think there should be room to accommodate that in governance.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. I think that was a wonderful conversation. Just to keep on keeping on with DAO governance.